You know, we're blessed here in Texas to have people like Jim here, native Texans, and then we're cursed at the same time because, you know, there's a yin and yang going on. For all the good we have, there's a lot of evil emanating from here. And before we get going on this alien agenda, we're going to talk about something real quick. Monday at the state capitol, if you guys can be there, I need you to get there. We've got a Senate bill coming up, and it's on the animal chipping, on the NAIS, and the premise ID. You know, I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of elite quotes and Kissinger quotes, but you know, they know that if they can control the food and the water, they can control you. Obama's got his little million-man army in place, this little green revolution army that's going to monitor food now. And there's also bills to keep you from growing food. So be very aware, you know, we can't do much fighting against what's coming unless we can have a little bit of food in our belly. So the website to go to, sorry about this boring part, but it's really important, farmandranchfreedom.org. That's Judith McGarry's website. It's farmandranchfreedom.org. And Monday, the 23rd of March at 3 p.m., and it's in the extension. It's kind of in the catacombs of the Capitol where they do the, you know, administrative business, not the legal business of government. But, yeah, it's room E1.012. E1.012. Guys, get there, sign up, and if you can't do that, go to the website, and there's some forms to send emails and letters to your senators. We've got to protect our food integrity at this point. Not everybody's going to want to eat fresh food. They're going to have food of convenience, and that's okay for most, but we need to arm ourselves. 3 o'clock Monday. Please be there. All right. My name is Kevin Smith, and I've been involved in the truth movement and the patriot movement or whatever, alternate media movement, whatever you want to call it. And I did a lot to make 9/11 more acceptable to mainstream. And I looked for a lot of avenues to get that message out there where we wouldn't just be preaching to the choir all the time and make it and figure out ways that, you know, someone's ox was being gored. Maybe not the way mine was, but a way to reach out to them and make them understand that, hey, there's some things about 9/11. It's an inside job. You need to research it. And the one thing I used to run away from with, like, my hair on fire was anybody that was talking about UFOs. Was anybody that, and not because my father's an aerospace engineer. I was taught to fly by a 2-star general. These are things that we all knew, but if you didn't want to risk your career, you kept quiet about it. And I just looked at it from a point of view that whenever I've been challenged about 9/11, it's the Bigfoot, the grassy knoll, Chupacabra. You know the routine, it's the template they use to tear you down. So I always tried to separate it. But there's a problem, though, because once you start to understand in any of these topics that you've been lied to and the history that you've been fed was incorrect or at best a spin of the real truth, then you start to see a lot of commonalities. And when you understand about the JFK assassination, it makes it that much easier to understand about the Nazis running this country now. And so these things start to become intertwined. But we run into a problem, especially in 9/11 Truth, is that once we came up with a sexy new theory on something, we tend to cast everything that we knew that was proven away. And I think it kind of goes to that Goering saying, you know, the bigger the lie, the more apt people are to believe it. So we run into a problem with people wanting to have the newest, sexiest thing that they can get excited about, maybe put their name on and claim their claim of fame. So what we have here with Mr. Jim Marrs is a professional, trained journalist, an investigative reporter, and the oxymoron of being Army intelligence also. But we have a real Texan that looked into the stuff in depth, speculated very little, and built facts around his case, and was able to present it in a way that's understandable and acceptable. And that's one of the, Jim, you're the only guy that I will let mix 9/11 and stand in the same shot with and UFOs, because he can defend it. He can break it down, and he can say, well, today we're talking about aliens or UFOs. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the Nazis and 9/11. So I wouldn't get up here and introduce a guy like this if I didn't have full faith in him. So I'm going to shut up. Everybody, Jim Marrs, we're going to talk about UFOs tonight better than ever before. Thank you. Man, I'm sorry to have to do that disclaimer. That's right.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. Yeah, that kind of stole some of my thunder, though, but he's absolutely right. When Crossfire came out and right after the Oliver Stone movie, you know, I was the darling of the JFK research community. And then I wrote Alien Agenda. I was disinvited to their conferences, you know. I was held at arm's length for about 6-8 years because I wrote about UFOs, as if that somehow disqualifies me from knowing anything about anything else. But that time has passed. Just this past November, I was invited back to the JFK Lancer thing in Dallas, and they actually gave me an award for being one of the early, long-time, and most steadfast seekers of truth in the JFK assassination. So maybe I've been slightly rehabilitated. All right, now I see a lot of familiar faces. So a lot of you have been down here before to New Brave Books, and you've heard me talk about 9/11, and you've heard me talk about the National Socialist takeover in this country, which now they got so blatant in their excesses that in November, thanks to the corporate mass media, we have now shifted from National Socialism to Marxist Socialism. And if you think that this is some kind of fringe conspiracy theory, just consider the cover of Newsweek a couple of weeks ago. Now we are all socialist. Yeah, we are. But when did we ever get the chance to vote for socialism? Is that really what we want, you know? And is that, who's behind all that? And before, let me add to one more thing, because I know some of you people are already cringing because you're probably great Obama fans. And let me say right off the bat, I got nothing personally against Barack Hussein Obama any more than I had against George W. Bush, personally. I know people who are good friends with George W. Bush, and they assured me that he was quite a good old boy. And I'm not prepared to argue. He may very well have been. But I think what we all understand is that he wasn't in charge. Dick Cheney was in charge. And his little presidential assassination ring, if you've happened to read that and know about what Seymour Hersh has now let out of the bag, and Dad, he was also there, and James Baker. And speaking of Dad, just to add a coda to those of you who heard my Rise of the Fourth Reich talk, last July in Germany, George Herbert Walker Bush was presented with this great award and hailed as being the one person most responsible for the reunification of Germany. George Herbert Walker Bush? And who gave him this award? Henry Kissinger. It gets better. And where did this award ceremony take place? On the shores of the Wannsee. Does anybody remember the Wannsee Conference of 1942? This is where the Nazis all met and decided on the final solution. Now, do you think this was just some kind of sheer coincidence, or are they thumbing their nose at us? And speaking of Dr. Kissinger, for any of you who are still hoping that Barack Obama may bring us some change, let me quote from the remarks of his new National Security Advisor, General James L. Jones, who last month at the Munich Security Conference got up and thanked them for honoring Dr. Kissinger, who, by the way, cannot travel to certain countries because there are warrants out for his arrest for war crimes, okay? And James L. Jones, Obama's National Security Advisor, says, thank you, congratulations for honoring Dr. Kissinger, says, as the latest National Security Advisor for the United States, I take my daily orders from Dr. Kissinger, coming through Brent Snowcroft and Sandy Berger. We have a chain of command in the National Security Council, and it still exists today. Excuse me, where's the change? I didn't vote for Henry Kissinger. And these are the same tools that have been in there, were there in the Clinton administration when they stripped our military. And Henry Kissinger's been there since Nixon. He is the architect of the very foreign policy that's gotten us in the mess that we're in now. So what's changed, folks? I submit to you, nothing. But now, away from mundane politics, we're going to talk about UFOs. Let me quickly see a show of hands. How many of you have had or know about someone who has had a UFO experience? Whoa! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Okay. I took a head count ahead of time. We've got about 60 people here, maybe plus or minus, and that looked to be about half of you. Half the people in this audience have had or know of some UFO experience. Now, extrapolate that up to the 300 million population of the United States. Half the people in this country know about UFOs. Okay? And I guarantee you that the higher you get, and you get away from the guy in the street, and you get away from the people who just get their information from CNN or Fox, and you start talking to people high in the military, high in intelligence, or in the upper echelons of the political circles, they don't snicker at you about UFOs because they know it's here. And my main message tonight is, if you dismiss the whole topic of UFOs, then, folks, you will never, ever be able to truthfully understand what's going on in the world because you've just tossed out a big piece of the puzzle. So with that, let me bring you up to speed on UFOs. Some of this is old stuff to some of you. Some of it hopefully will be new. Oops, I guess it helps turn it on. Okay. First off, you go back, and if you go Google UFOs or go back and look at the newspaper clips, you'll find that since 1947, there's been a literal barrage of information. And yeah, some of them are hoaxes, some of them are deluded people, some of them are strange, you know, but hey, you can discount half of them or more, and you still have a significant number of reports that means there's something going on, okay? Now, early on, the explanation was that there's nothing up there, folks. It's all just hallucinations or some sort of group psychosis. Well, you know, even as a young reporter, I thought, oh, wait a minute. A heretofore undiagnosed, contagious mass psychosis. Whoa, what a story. But you don't see that anymore, do you? And you've never seen anything about that because it's not true. And you don't ever hear these explanations anymore. But why? Because now with YouTube and the computer, there's not a day goes by that somebody's not posting photographs and film and camera snapshots of a UFO. So obviously you can't take a picture of an hallucination or of a psychosis. So that explanation, you don't hear that anymore. So today it's, oh, well, it's just misidentified aircraft or satellites or the planet Venus, or probably it's secret government test craft, okay? So I always thought, well, wouldn't it be great if there was a really documented story of a UFO that occurred before any of that was in the air? And you know what? There is. And of course, it all got started with Kenneth Arnold, 1947, and that got the whole flying saucer thing going, but they all said, well, it's just misidentified aircraft. Well, it was recorded in Aurora, Texas. Here's the story that appeared in the Dallas Morning News, April the 19th, 1897. 6 years before the Wright brothers flew. 6 years before the first powered balloon flight in the United States, the California era. About 6 o'clock this morning, the early riser of Aurora was astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which had been sailing through the country. It's traveling due north and much nearer the earth than ever before. Evidently, some of the machinery is out of order because it's making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour. Think about that, 10 or 12 miles an hour. Anybody know about aviation? Anybody know about lift? It's not airspeed, is it, Kevin? Can't stay in the air at 10 or 12 miles an hour, so there had to be something else going on. It sailed directly over the public square, and when it reached the north part of town, collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank, and destroying the judge's flower garden. Shame, shame. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one on board, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original have been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Whoa. And there's a picture of the little tombstone because he was buried in the Aurora Cemetery. And there's a photograph of the little headstone, so you'll know that I'm not just making this up. And when I got onto this story in 1973, that headstone was still there. And it was very interesting because, as you can see here, we put a chalk outline on the little design that was etched in it. And you see this inverted V with little circles along the center of it. Now, so far, I'm trying to deal with conspiracy facts. People have accused me of being a conspiracy theorist, okay? I sometimes bristle at that because I try to explain, if you can prove something, it's not a theory, all right? But now, here's a theory. I was under the impression, because you can see that this side of it kind of rounded, and then it's broken off here in the middle. So I was kind of under the impression when I was looking at it that it looks like half of it may have been broken off at some point, and you're only seeing half of what the original headstone was. So if you extrapolate the thing over to here and you duplicate and reverse this, what have you got? You've got a saucer-looking object with little portholes running along the side, okay? But did it happen? In 1973, there were 3 people still alive who were alive in the Aurora area in 1897. One of them said it was a hoax. One of them, Mary Evans, said, no, I remember my folks talking about it. I remember hearing the explosion, but they wouldn't let me go into town because I was only about 12 or 13 years old, but they came back and told me about it. So she says it actually happened. Then we got Charlie Stevens, who I talked to, and he actually saw the thing. And he said he saw it going over, and he said he heard an explosion. He saw the smoke coming up from town, and that young boy, he wanted to run up and see what had happened. Now, if Charlie was making up this story, what do you think he would say? He said, I ran out of town, I saw these pieces, and I saw this little green guy, and he'd give you this big story. No, that's not what he told me. What he told me struck me as very truthful. He said his dad told him, no, son, we can't go to town. We have to finish the chores. Now, think about it, folks. 1897, rural Texas. If you didn't do the chores, you didn't eat. So I think that was a very truthful station. So now you got Mary Evans, who was there, said it happened. You got Charlie Stevens, who was there, and he said it happened. And then you got this fella, Robert Brown, who found this odd thing in the 80s that he claimed was a piece of the spaceship. Except you can see how crudely made it is. I don't think this was a piece of the spaceship, but what's interesting is it's 2 pieces of metal banded together with this wire, and inside you can kind of see this copper-looking stuff. I think that maybe in the middle was a piece of the original spaceship, but we don't know, and he wouldn't give it up to go have it tested, so again, it's just a we don't know. Here's the original Dallas Morning News story. And so the 2 people there out of the 3 said it actually happened. Now the argument is, well, it was just a hoax story planted in the newspaper. Well, okay, that's possible, and I kind of bought into that for a long time until I got the complete front page of the Dallas Morning News for 1897. And, folks, there are 16 stories on that front page. Every single one of them is talking about the silver cigar-shaped object flying through the skies of North Texas in 1897, and 2 or 3 of them even carrying accounts of carrying on a conversation with the crews. One of them, they were told, we come from a secret laboratory in New York, and we were testing this thing out, and it proved so successful, we just started sailing through the countryside, and the next thing you knew, we were in Kansas. So we thought we'd come on down to Texas. Another story, they were told, we come from a hidden community at the North Pole, and we have these flying machines. And then in another account at that same period, a track inspector from Fort Worth encountered this silver cigar-shaped object, said there was a crew of uniformed people around it, and he was told, don't say anything about seeing us. We're on a secret mission. We're on our way to bomb Havana. Now, this is especially intriguing to me because this was in the spring of 1897. We didn't get into a war with Spain and Cuba until the spring of 1898, a year later. How did these people know that we were going to be in a war involving Cuba? Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, remember your school? Okay, how did they know? Were they able to look into time? Did they come from another time? I don't know, but something's very strange there. Okay? Right. Yeah, and all of this occurred before the Wright brothers flew. In 1955, Dorothy Kilgallen told us the reality of it in this story that is absolutely legitimate because I copied it out of the files of the Fourth Star Telegram. And she said that they come from other planets, and source of my information is a British official of cabinet rank. So they knew way back there that it was all real. Now, what the heck is going on? I missed all my... Anyway, this thing's kind of out of sequence. Before I get to the moon, let me wrap up on Aurora. So the only arguments they've had against Aurora is that, number one of the people from that time period, Robbie Hansen, said, oh, it was just a hoax. Now, unfortunately, her close friend was Etta Pegues, that was the Star-Telegram correspondent in that area. And so through the years, when anybody would contact Star-Telegram and say, hey, what about the Aurora spaceship, they would send them to Etta Pegues, and Etta Pegues would tell them it was all just a hoax. And you'll find lots of columns written in the Dallas News and stuff recently in the 70s and the 80s, in the 90s, and they said, oh, it was all just a hoax. And that's all basically because the stringer up there, the correspondent, Etta Pegues, told everybody it was a hoax. And she said this because Etta Pegues, her friend, told her it was a hoax. Well, I went and talked to Robbie Hansen, and her story was that she lived way outside of Aurora and never knew anything happened until one day somebody rode by on horseback and told her father about this crash and the little man they buried in the cemetery, and her father laughed and laughed and said, well, that old Judge Proctor, what a joker. So that's her basis for believing it was a hoax, although by her own story she had no direct knowledge of it. So you got two people with direct knowledge, two people with indirect knowledge. One said it was a hoax. One said my parents were there. And you had Charlie Stevens who said it actually happened. Okay, and then of course their argument is that Judge Proctor didn't have a windmill, and that it was all a hoax story, and therefore there's no grave in the cemetery. Well, all this got laid to rest last summer. Have any of y'all seen the History Channel special? Bunch of you, good. Basically, this was aired back, I think, about Christmas time, and then they ran it again just about a week or so ago. They came with a scientific crew to Aurora, and they used ground-penetrating radar, and they found that there is a small grave at the site. Oops, took care of that argument. Then they went and managed to get the owner of the property to let them move the little well house, whereupon they found the footing for the windmill tower, or for the windlass. So that takes care of that argument. In fact, what I understood years ago was that it's true Judge Proctor did not have a windmill. He had a windlass, which is a wooden derrick that normally you could put a windmill on top of the blades, but he didn't have the windmill, but it was a derrick he used for the sump to operate the pump on his well. Okay, so now they proved he did have this tower. It just got misidentified as a windmill instead of a windlass. Okay, but here's the clincher. Back in the 70s, we picked up odd pieces of metal there at the crash site, and a lot of it was very readily identifiable, old pieces of nail, chain, whatever. But then we also found some odd pieces that looked to be like molten aluminum, and we sent it off for study at North Texas. And I usually have, I don't know why these slides are all out of whack. We may get to this. And the physics department said some of these pieces were a little unusual, and one was particularly unusual because it was 90% iron, but it had no magnetic properties. But that was about all we had the time and money to do, so we left it at that. Well, what they did last summer is they also found globs, little tiny globs of what appeared to be molten aluminum, buried 6 inches into the ground and into the trees surrounding and into rocks. indicating a tremendous explosion. Okay, and then when they tested the metal, it did prove to be aluminum, but the metallic composition was not the same composition as modern aluminum or any of the aluminum that we know about. If you go back, even in the story in the Dallas News, it said the metal appeared to be some sort of metal kind of like aluminum or silver. Well, so they knew about aluminum in 1897. But it had only been 2 years earlier, in 1895, that they'd been able to synthetically make aluminum. Prior to that, a little bit of aluminum cost about the same amount as gold or silver. So although they knew about aluminum, it was not in widespread use in 1897, certainly not in rural Texas. So as far as I'm concerned, it happened. We had a spaceship crash. And by the way, it's on the Texas State Historical Marker at the Aurora Cemetery. So now let's look at another UFO, unidentified flying object. This one, you've all seen it. It's called the moon. But the moon's a very strange place. We've got the Maria, which they call the seas, which appear to be molten rocks that was thrown up onto the surface and then cooled into what they call the Maria. And that's why when they went to the moon, they were expecting to find volcanic activity, and yet when they get to the moon, we find there is no volcanic activity. It's a dead world. So where did this molten rock come from? We don't know. But at the center of these circular seas, or Maria, are what they call mascons. The mascons are very heavy, dense objects of something that are somehow always at the center of these Maria. Are they some kind of ancient machine that spewed up molten rock onto the surface of the moon? We don't know. We don't know what the mascons are. We don't know what the Maria is. The moon is very mysterious. Now here is some figures drawn by early man, similar to the Nazca plains, which you all are probably similar with. And on the moon, we find similar type designs. Okay, now where does that come from? Is it natural? We don't know. But we're not being told either. Always remember, NASA is short for never a straight answer. We also have what's known as the shard photograph from the Lunar Orbiter 111. And this thing juts up off the surface of the moon about a mile. Just like a little spindle or a tower. Is that a microwave tower? Who knows? We don't know, but it's very mysterious. We've got pictures. These are all NASA photographs, by the way. Look at this thing flitting across the surface of the moon. This thing throwing a shadow on the surface of the moon. What is this thing? And here's one jutting out over a crater. All kinds of odd stuff. People have been seeing weird things on the moon for centuries. All the way back into when they first developed telescopes, they were seeing lights moving around on the moon. They were seeing what appeared to be clouds of dust or some sort of particles moving around on the moon. You didn't get taught this in school, though, did you? And we can see in this crater some kind of weird object. Again, we see this long cigar-looking type object sitting in a crater on the moon. What is this? We don't know. Yes, I love this one. You see the tracks running along here to this little circular type object, and it's rolled along, leaving tracks on the moon. Now, my first thought was, oh well, it was up here on the top of this crater, and it rolled off and rolled down the side of the crater, which is possibly so. Now, unfortunately, this came out of a book, and the reproduction's not very good, but I've seen a clear photograph, and the tracks go down into the crater, so it rolled up the side of the crater and then down the side of the crater. Something's moving around on the moon. What is it? Don't ask me. I'm just giving you the information. More tracks on the moon. And here's an odd little X in the middle of a crater. We don't know what this is, but it's all very odd. The day before the Apollo 11 landed on the moon, the astronauts reported sighting some mysterious lunar lights in an area where scientists believe there are volcanoes. This is back when they were still saying there was volcanic activity on the moon, so it was okay to release this story. And he said it was in the crater Aristarchus in the northeastern part of the moon's face. And astronomers have claimed observing bright spots in the area, which they appear to be volcanoes. And Buzz Aldrin said, well, the area is definitely brighter than anything else I can see. And so this has all been dutifully reported, but then it goes dark. You don't hear any more about that. So what is with the moon anyway? When I was in school, we were taught the moon broke away from the Earth. And maybe that's what created the big hole, which is now the Pacific Ocean. But now that they say we've been to the moon and we got lunar rocks and they don't match the same composition as what's on the Earth, plus they found rocks on the moon that date back before 8 billion years ago, which is older than the age of the Earth, then now it's changed. Now the idea is the capture theory, that the moon came along and was captured in the gravitational field of the Earth. Something like that, see? Oh, it comes bobbing around, it gets caught, it goes back. The problem is this. If here's the Earth and here comes the moon and it's caught and it's pulled back, then the moon should be in an elliptical orbit, kind of wobbling around the Earth. But it's not. It's in a near perfect circular orbit and stationary, one side always facing the Earth. We know this. You were taught this in school, but you really had never stopped to think about it. How did it get like that? Isaac Asimov, famous science fiction writer and a very noted scientist, said the moon shouldn't be where it is. How did it get there? And, by the way, the moon is at the exact distance away from the Earth so that when there is a solar eclipse, it covers the exact circumference of the sun. You can see the corona of the sun all around it, but you can't see the sun because it's at the exact distance from the Earth where it blocks out just the exact circumference of the sun. Whoa, oh, that's pretty precise. How does that happen naturally? The answer is it cannot. So that means somebody parked the moon. But here we get to the conundrum of extraterrestrials, because we all know there's no such thing as extraterrestrials. But we also know that the moon is in a very unusual orbit, and somebody must have parked it there. It's been there since our recorded history, so we know we didn't do it. And so, since we know there's no such thing as extraterrestrials, how do we deal with this subject? We don't. We just don't talk about it. Okay? Go ask some of your astronomer friends, how'd the moon get there? And let them start shuffling and jiving and trying to come up with an explanation, because we don't know. So apparently somebody came in and parked the moon exactly where it is, and the moon's orbit is nearly perfect circular to the Earth with only a slight wobble, which just coincidentally matches the slight wobble of the orbit of the Earth, and it's also at the equator. There also appears to be pyramids on the moon. You can see what appears to be pyramids in this crater up here, and in other areas too. Interestingly enough, the pyramids that are sighted on the moon are in the same configuration as the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau. And if that's not odd enough, we look at Teotihuacan outside Mexico City, and if you'll simply shift that thing around, they're in the same configuration as the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Now, how does that get to be? Something's going on here, folks. And now, of course, we see the pyramids on Mars, okay, and the famous face on Mars. Now, just for you all tonight, got a special treat for you. I'm going to show you a close-up of the face on Mars. All right. Enough levity. Actually, here's the face on Mars. And then, of course, when NASA finally was, it got to be a big deal, they finally showed us this picture. Oh, yeah, well, we can really see that one. And by the way, there's been much more further work done on this. This is kind of an old slideshow. And now they've actually done computer work on it, and there's something on the face of Mars. And again, we didn't put it there, but we know there's no extraterrestrials, so let's just don't talk about that. By the way, here's another face on Mars. I think everybody can kind of see this one. And I don't know, this is in my HUF file. It is possible that those are just natural formations and that you make a face out of it, kind of like you do making the face of Jesus out of a cloud or something, but it's still pretty amazing. And of course, we got the rover Sojourner that went up there and crawled around for a few feet. And they said, see, no life on Mars. Well, excuse me, think about this. What if we lived on Mars and we sent a little rover and it landed in Antarctica and it roamed around for about 20, 30 feet? Hey, no life on the Earth. By the way, it's all changing. It's all changing. We now know there's water on the moon. We now know there's winds on the moon. We know there's water on Mars. They just were finally announcing that last week. Okay, so everything you think you know about Moon and Mars, you don't know because they haven't told you, and it's changing constantly. This kind of leads to the question, well, if there's ETs been around here, how long have they been here? Or did our ancestors come from space? Well, you go back to the Sumerian tablets, which are probably the oldest records on the world. In fact, actually, you can go to the Hindu Vedas, and they talk about the Vyanas, little flying machines that went through the air, and all carried their gods around, and that they had, by the way, they had some sort of weaponry that could destroy a whole city with a single strike. Then you go back to the Sumerian tablets, and this was all etched in clay back about 8,000 years ago, predates the Egyptians by 3,000 or 4,000 years, predates the Bible by 5,000 years, and they're telling us that the Anunnaki came to the earth. Well, who's the Anunnaki? Well, that translates as those who came from the heavens to the earth. But let me clear something up here. I'm not sure if I get into this. Let me see if I get into it. There's a common theme all over the earth in all the ancient legends and stories, and the common theme is flight. The Chinese had the flying dragons. The Egyptians had the flying boats. The Sumerians had their flying disc. We all know the story of Ezekiel in the Bible and the fiery wheel. If that wasn't a UFO experience, I don't know what was. And we have artifacts, anomalies, as the scientists would call them, because it doesn't conveniently fit into the little homogenized history that we've all been told. We've got these little dudes that have been found down in Colombia and dated back several thousand years. It looks like a little jet plane to me. And by the way, I don't think I have a graphic of this, but some of you have probably seen this picture. My wife and I just got back from a trip to Egypt, and in Seti's temple, up on the ceiling, you see these reliefs. And I swear to God, one of them looks like an Apache helicopter. And right next to it is a little fat jet with wings and a tail, exactly like you're seeing here. It's like, what in the world were these people drawing, And is this some kind of just incredible coincidence, or was there high technology in the ancient past? This is the Antikythera mechanism, which was discovered back about 1911 or so. It was sunk in an ancient Greek ship. They dated it back to a couple of thousand years ago. And at first they didn't know what it was, but then as the years rolled on and we got kind of computer savvy, they realized it was a computer. It's got little gears within gears within gears, and it was really quite advanced. And this of course was made centuries before even the invention of the printing press. So we got all this stuff. The ancient Sumerians, by the way, in this relief show us the planets of the solar system and their relative size. How'd they know all that? Pluto was only discovered in 1930 and Neptune in 1846. How did these ancient Sumerians know the makeup, composition, and relative sizes of our solar system unless they had ancient information? Other artifacts around the world are this hammer, or this axe that was found buried in a stone, and the stone tracks back to several thousand years. You got human handprints. You all know about the human footprints down at Biloxi or near Glenrose that's in the same strata with dinosaurs. Where'd that come from? You've got the round balls of Guatemala, these perfectly round balls. Try to make something round. Get you some clay and try to make by hand a perfectly round ball. You're going to have a real tough time of it, okay? And but yet these are perfectly round, and some of them are huge. Some of them are 4-8 feet in diameter. Where'd they come from? Who made them? We don't know. You got the Baghdad Battery. They found this over in Iraq, which used to be ancient Mesopotamia, which in the Bible was called Chaldea. And by the way, the patriarch of both the Jews and the Palestinians was Abraham. And where did Abraham come from? Was he just some Semite dragging his tent through the desert? No, he came from Ur of Chaldea. Ur is one of the major cities in ancient Sumeria. He was a Sumerian. He had the knowledge, and he brought it into Egypt, and the next thing you know, there's this huge technologically advanced civilization in Egypt. So from the side of ancient cities in Iraq, the one place where you can't go now, in fact, I don't think anybody really wants to go, we found the Baghdad Battery. And they didn't know what this was for a long time until somebody figured out you can put grape juice in there that's highly acidic, put the copper tube in, put the other thing in, you get a half volt of electricity. So they had electricity all the way back there. They knew about this. You don't get taught that in school, do you? No, it's in a museum. It's still around. Yeah, it's still around. This is a 1680 French coin, and look, here's the town and steeple and countryside, and here's this giant wheel flying through the sky. They've tried to tell us this for years. Everybody knew about this. They just didn't know what it was. We're the first generations who grew up with the true knowledge of space flight, cloning, genetic manipulation. We could understand all this stuff where they couldn't, but we don't get told about this. In fact, I strongly suspect that a major reason for our precipitous and unprovoked attack on Iraq was to loot the Iraqi National Museum. Because I have the stories in my files from 1999, 2000, 2001, that French and German archaeological teams were making amazing new discoveries in the ancient Sumerian cities of Uruk and Ur. And of course, where would that all be taken? To the Iraqi National Museum. And would they immediately put it on display? No. It'd be taken and stored in the basement until they could catalog it and study it, clean it all up, and prepare it for exhibition. We do know that Saddam Hussein believed himself the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar, and that he was rebuilding Babylon. So he obviously had a great interest in all this. I find it also interesting that the two nations who most opposed our invasion of Iraq were France and Germany, who had the archaeological teams in there. And when we launched our invasion, contrary to standard military tactics, which is to go and seize your objective, hold your objective, consolidate the countryside and your winnings, and then move on to the next objective, we simply made a beeline for Baghdad. And this is why we failed to pacify the countryside, and we're still having problems. And what happened in Baghdad? The looting of the Iraqi National Museum, even though the Pentagon, at the request of world museum directors, had pledged that we would safeguard the Iraqi National Museum because it was, after all, in the very center of the creation of the human race. Between the Tigris-Euphrates River, this is where people estimate the Garden of Eden was. This is where it all started. Western civilization started between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they pledged they would safeguard it. And yet, when the mobs, probably hired stooges, began to break into the museum, the U.S. military was called, a tank with some soldiers showed up, and then were ordered to withdraw. and the crowds had their way. Well, the crowds were probably a smokescreen, and there was a very systematic looting of the Iraqi National Museum. And according to Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who investigated the museum break-in for General Tommy Franks, in an article in Archaeological Magazine, he said the basement was an inside job. They had keys to the vaults. They bypassed expensive-looking fakes. Guards were suspiciously missing that day. And they then said of all the stuff that the hired mob took out of the upper floors of the museum, a greater part of that has now been returned. I mean, that makes sense. You know, Abdul got something, went out, and what's he going to do with it? He's going to take it to the local flea market and try to get some money for it, and it'll find its way back to the museum. So they've recovered most of this. But Bogdanos said the basement, said they haven't recovered hardly anything they took out of the basement. And what would have been in the basement? The newly found stuff, a Stargate, okay? You know, who knows what? But they've got to have that ancient technology. And where did it come from? Didn't come from us. Oh, here is the skull of an auroch, an extinct ox, that has, for what all practical purposes, appears to be a bullet hole in it. And this ox has been dated back several thousand years, long before there were any firearms. So who knows? Are we talking about aliens? Are we talking about extraterrestrial beings? Are we talking about interdimensional beings? Or are we talking about time travelers? I don't know. All I'm trying to tell you is there's a reality here that we're not being told about. Now, between 1897 and the Aurora spaceship crash, which, by the way, while I was doing a documentary on that, a fellow showed up with his young son, and we were filming at the Wise County Courthouse. And he said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" And I said, "Well, we're making a documentary about the spaceship crash in Aurora back in 1897. He says, "Oh, I know all about that. My grandfather was there." So I immediately had him sign a release and set him down and had an interview with him. And one of the interesting things that came out of this interview, because his grandfather had similar to what I'd already heard. There was an explosion. People heard it. They ran into town. There was all this metal lying around. They all picked it up, and et cetera, et cetera. But his grandfather added one little added note. He said that within hours, representatives of every law enforcement agency in Texas were showing up. I said, "Well, what did he say they did?" And he said, "Well, about half of them went around saying, 'Okay, folks, go back to your home. You know, it's all over here, nothing to see.' And the other half were loading up the metal and putting it in wagons and hauling it off." In other words, perhaps the earliest crash retrieval. But between 1897 and the crash retrieval at Roswell in 1947, we had the Los Angeles air raid, which I'm sure most of you have never heard about. February the 25th, 1942. Now, this is only 2 months or so after Pearl Harbor. And the West Coast was jittery, with good reason. The Hawaiian Islands had been attacked, the Sixth Fleet had been sunk, and there were reports and rumors flying that the Japanese were about to invade the West Coast at any minute. And that wasn't all just hearsay. About a month before this, in January 1942, a Japanese submarine had surfaced off the coast of California and shelled an oil refinery. So their war jitters were not entirely unjustified. On the night of February the 25th, they used one of our new secret weapons, radar. And they had just installed it there in Los Angeles. And the new radar picked up a flight of objects coming at very high speed eastward across the Pacific on a trajectory towards Los Angeles. So at about 11 o'clock at night, the air raid sirens went off. And from 11 till like 2 in the morning, there was a constant booming as the anti-aircraft guns expended thousands of rounds of ammunition. Searchlights were playing in the sky. People died. There were at least 6 casualties, several from heart attacks, some from car crashes, some from being hit by ordnance falling back to earth. A lot of damage to homes with, you know, you fire thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft fire into the air, there's pieces of junk's going to fall back down and cause some damage. Those of you who want to celebrate firing a gun in the air, remember that. Okay. The Army said this was a real alarm. But the next day, higher authorities, Harold Stimson, the Secretary of War, said, no, nothing happened. It's just war jitters. So it quickly dropped from the media, and it dropped from everybody's memory because World War II was on. Jimmy Doolittle's raid took place shortly after this. Then, we lost the Philippines, and then et cetera, et cetera. History moved on, and everybody forgot about the Los Angeles air raid. But we still have the photographs that were made there, including this one. And some enterprising person with a computer got the photograph and simply reversed it. And, now we see that they weren't just war jitters. There really was something. These little bright spots, by the way, are just explosions from the anti-aircraft gun. Let me go back. See? That's the anti-aircraft explosions. You can almost see the object right here. But when you reverse the photograph, it's very clear. You got a saucer-shaped object. Now, furthermore, we now have these documents, which was a memo from FDR to George Marshall regarding the recovery of unconventional aircraft. As indicated in my recent memorandum to you regarding the war, the air raid over Los Angeles has been learned from Army GQ that Rear Admiral Anderson with Naval Intelligence has informed the War Department of a naval recovery of an unidentified plane off the coast of California, unlike having any bearing on conventional explanation. Further, it was revealed that the Army Air Corps had recovered a similar object in the San Bernardino Mountains east of Los Angeles, which cannot be identified as conventional aircraft. So in 1942, they're recovering unconventional aircraft that they know does not belong to us, and I'm sure it didn't take them long to figure out it didn't belong to the Japanese either. Now, here's what's interesting. At the bottom of this memo, we see that George Marshall says, the Chief of Staff, I have further ordered a thorough investigation of all War Department files regarding unconventional aerial phenomena reported since 1897, the very year of the Aurora spaceship crash. See how it all fits together? It's all real, folks. It's very real. Of course, you know about the Foo Fighters during World War II, and the Germans, we said, well, here's a clip from the New York Times, said it's the Nazis' newest war device. And after the war, we found out the Nazis thought they were some kind of secret weapon of ours. Okay? So it didn't belong to any of us. The Japanese reported them, too, by the way. And there were reports of these fireballs in the Pacific. Now, some of these may have indeed been a Nazi secret weapon called a Feuerball, or the fireball, which was a little device that they would put up in the bomber formations in the hopes of disrupting their electrical systems, okay? The problem was back then we were using these heavily insulated wires and vacuum tubes, and they didn't really have that much effect. Today, they might really have an effect on a computer or something that's not protected. Saucers of the Reich. We know, and it's historic fact, that they had flying saucers on the drawing board. We've already covered some of this in the rise of the Fourth Reich, so I'll skip on through it. We also talked about Action Adlerflug, or the Operation Eagle Flight, and how that the Nazis survived the war. Morton Bormann, who was deputy to Hitler, Hermann Schmitz, the head of IG Farben Combine, and by the way, also a man who owned as much stock in Standard Oil as John D. Rockefeller, and Dr. Hermann Joseph Abs, head of the German Central Bank, the Deutsche Bank, which is still one of the largest banks in the world and a very prominent player today. They created more than 750 corporations, in addition to about 700 corporations that they had already had set up in Switzerland, and by these German companies and involving these American companies. And it was all handled through the Bank of International Settlements, through the Deutsche Bank, Chase Bank, Union Banking Corporation, and of course, if you'll remember my talk from Rise of the Fourth Reich, who was handling the money for the Nazis through Union Banking Corporation? Prescott Bush, okay, the grandfather of George W. and the father of George Herbert Walker Bush. The attorneys for the Nazi Schroeder Bank that was handling it for Baron von Schroeder, who was Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles. Now, this is how the Nazis got a foothold in the United States after the war, because after the war, John J. McCloy, who had been head of National City Bank, which is now Citicorp, was one of the largest lenders of money to the Nazis. In fact, he sat in the same box with Hitler in the 1936 Olympics. And all of this just kept going. Business is just business. John...
Wasn't at that meeting the night before JFK was assassinated up in Dallas, John J. McCloy?
That's possible. He had been in Texas along with Allen Dulles. I've seen a photograph of Allen Dulles with Lyndon Johnson taken within days of the Kennedy assassination. So they were all together. But this is another whole topic, okay? This goes back to the rise of the Fourth Reich. So let's keep moving along here. That brings us to what crashed at Roswell. That's the most famous of the crash recovery stories, but of course everybody, oh gosh, it was this, it was that, no, maybe it was this, who knows? Well, let's just look at it objectively. First off, the government has changed its story 4 times. Right off the bat, the base commander, Colonel Butch Blanchard, authorized the release of a news release that said, "We have captured a flying saucer." Okay? Higher authorities, General Ramey over the 6th Air Force, I guess it was, out of Carswell, said, no, they got it all wrong. It was not a flying saucer. It was just a weather balloon. They just mistook a weather balloon for this flying saucer. Now, let me point out a few things here. Number one, the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield in New Mexico was the only unit in the U.S. military at that time equipped with nuclear weapons. They were the group that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These were the first-string guys. These were the best military people we had. And Major Marcel, who was their intelligence officer, had been on Tinian and had been involved in the bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And to tell us that these guys couldn't tell a flying saucer from balloon wreckage is an affront to your sensibilities. They're insulting your intelligence. And if that doesn't prove something to you, then how many of you guys been in the military? Anybody? But it's good. Me too. Now, you know, in the military, the surefire way to advancement is very simple. Don't screw up. Okay? Don't screw up. If you mind your P's and Q's, follow your orders, then chances are you can advance. Colonel Blanchard, okay, he authorized the release, said, "We've captured a flying saucer." And then they came back, higher authorities, and said, no, it was just a weather balloon. He screwed up. Okay? Either it was a flying saucer and they didn't want that information out, which means he really messed up, or it really was a huge cock-up and it was a weather balloon, in which case he screwed up too. So in the military, you know that if you mess up like that, his next assignment should have been Nome, Alaska. Okay? That should have been the last we ever heard of Colonel Blanchard. Au contraire, Colonel Blanchard went on to become the second youngest brigadier general in U.S. military history, second only to George Custer. And Custer's advancement to colonel had been general had been a mistake. Okay? And at the time of his death in the late 60s, Blanchard, General Blanchard, had been sent to Vietnam to write an overall report on our status in the Vietnam War. Whoa, this guy was a credible and promoted military leader. So in other words, when he said, "We've captured a flying saucer," he was telling the truth. And when he backed off and followed orders and said, "No, it was just a weather balloon," he was following orders. So he gets promoted. That's the way it works. Now, when all of this came about 1996 or so, the Air Force finally issued this report, the Roswell report, stamped "Case closed." And does that sound familiar? They always say "case closed." This is the final word. And in their background, they say, this comprehensive further examination, so-called Roswell incident, found no evidence whatsoever of flying saucer, space aliens, citizen government cover-up. By the way, that's interesting. They use the same verbiage as the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission never said there was no conspiracy to kill Kennedy. What they said over and over and again was, we could find no evidence of conspiracy. And of course they didn't, because they didn't go look for it. In fact, they systematically turned away and didn't look at any evidence supporting a conspiracy. Same thing here. We could find no evidence of space aliens. Well, of course not. You can't get to it. Barry Goldwater tried to go to Wright-Patterson, see if he could get in to view the space aliens. They wouldn't even let him in. You think they're going to let the guys writing this report in? But here's the clincher. By the time this report came out, they'd changed their story again. They said, okay, it really wasn't a weather balloon. We lied about that because it was a secret mogul balloon. Now, the mogul balloon was not even secret. A mogul balloon was a weather balloon, basically. The only thing classified about mogul was that it carried this very sensitive testing equipment into the upper atmosphere to test, and they were testing to see if the Soviets were setting off nuclear weapons. Now, don't ask me why they thought they had to send up balloons from New Mexico to see what the Soviets in Russia were setting off, when they could have sent those balloons off from Turkey or Japan or any number of places that are much closer to the Soviet Union, because I don't know, and they never explained. But so the only thing secret and classified about the mogul balloons was simply the information, the software that they were carrying. I might also point out that in one book written by a very pro-mogul balloon explanation for Roswell, he went a little overboard, and he actually gave every little statistical bit of information about the mogul balloon, and he pointed out that of 22 releases of these mogul balloons, they only recovered 8. Why such a low number? Because, as he pointed out himself, they didn't bother to go look for any more. Well, how classified is that? You don't even bother to go look for them. But then that didn't really satisfy anybody, so by 1997 they had added something else, and that was crash dummies. What they saw was crash dummies. Now, here's a picture, and by the way, this is Raymond Matson right here with his arm around one of the crash dummies. He was part of the crash dummy program, and I talked to Mr. Matson, and he laughed at the whole idea that what they had seen in 1947 was crash dummies because, as you can obviously see, they look like humans. They weigh the same as humans. It only makes sense if you're testing parachutes or ejection seats or whatever. You don't want a little 4-foot alien-looking guy. You want some guy that weighs and looks like a human. Plus, he said that you wouldn't have any trouble identifying them. He said because one of the problems they had was that when they parachute these crash dummies out, the wind currents would catch them and scatter them all over the countryside. So they said on front and back they had a big stencil that says, property of U.S. Air Force, $25 reward if you'll bring you back in, you know. None of that was found on whatever it was they found at Roswell. But here's the clincher. Obviously, you can see there's a whole lot of difference between a 4-foot big-headed alien and a 6-foot, 200-pound crash dummy. But in this same Roswell report, where they're trying to tell us it's just crash dummies, they thoughtfully gave us a listing of the high-altitude balloon dummy drops. The very first one took place on June the 23rd, 1954. Now, that leads me to recall when they had a press conference in summer of 1997, and Colonel Johnson got up and explained that what they had seen was crash dummies, and then he began to commence to show some old news footage of the crash dummies and some of the planes that were carrying them. And after he got through with his presentation and it went to questions from the media, one of the more astute reporters said, Colonel Johnson said, you're telling us this is what they saw in 1947, said, but you're showing us data and photographs that are obviously from the 1950s and 60s. And they came back to Johnson. You know what he said? I remember his words distinctly. He said, well, I really don't know what they saw in 1947. And I thought, well, then why are you having this news conference? And why are we listening to you? But this is what's going on, folks. And, of course, here's General Ramey right here with his weather officer holding some weather balloon debris. And I talked to Bon Johnson, who was a photographer for the Star-Telegram at that time, and he is convinced because he was there. They started to let him in. They suddenly pushed them all out of the room, held them around for a while, then let them back in, and here was Ramey, and here was the weather guy with his junk, and it didn't look like the same stuff they'd seen the first time. And he is still, to this day, convinced that they swapped the wreckage for this balloon debris, okay? But another thing is that when they allowed these pictures to be made of them holding the balloon wreckage, you notice in Ramey's hand is a telegram. Now, this is a picture that was published in a book, and it's, third, fourth generation and out of a book and pretty hazy, but they've gotten hold of an original print of this, and thanks to computer digitization, they were able to blow up this telegram to the point to where they can read some of the words on it. And it says bodies, crash site, retrieval, okay? Something very totally different than the story that it was just a crashed weather balloon. Of course, in 1947, General Ramey would have never, in his wildest dreams, thought that in the future that high school kids would have computers and could analyze this photograph enough to be able to read the message on the telegram. Amazing. So now, though, here's a partial list of people who have now spoken out and said, I was there, I saw the debris, I picked up the bodies, I carried the bodies to Roswell Army Air Force, I put them in boxes, I guarded the boxes, I loaded the boxes on aircraft, I flew the aircraft to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, yada, yada, yada. So, and also we now have documents that have now given us a pretty good view of what actually happened, including July the 3rd, radar stations in that's West Texas, White Sands Proving Ground, tracked two identified aircraft until both dropped off radar. The two crash sites have been located close to White Sands Proving Ground. Site landing zone 1 was located at a ranch near Corona, approximately 75 miles northwest of the town of Roswell. Site landing zone 2 was located approximately 20 miles southeast of the town of Socorro at latitude 334031, longitude blah, blah, blah. So in other words, there were two crash sites. Now this accounts for some of the confusion. People have argued, oh, it was at Corona, and others have argued, no, it was at Roswell. What apparently happened was this is all part of the same crash. The thing hit the ground, bam, and lost a lot of debris. This was the debris field. But then the major portion of it, or at least the flight compartment, the command deck, ricocheted and went way on over and ended up in a gully near Socorro. And this is reportedly where the bodies were found. So that's caused confusion, the fact that they've argued over was it this crash site or that crash site, and actually it's all part of the same crash. Interestingly enough, and this document is dated 1947, on arrival at Landing Zone 2, that would be the command module, personnel assessed the finds as not belonging in any aircraft, rocket, weapons, or balloon tests that are normally conducted from surrounding bases. First reports indicated the first crash investigators from Roswell that Landing Zone 1 was the remains of an Army Air Force top-secret mogul balloon. So originally they thought it was a mogul balloon. But when scientists from Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory arrived to inspect Landing Zone 2, it became apparent to all concerned that what had crashed in the desert was something out of this world. And they say, well, where's the pieces? Well, there are even pieces now that have been studied that they claim come from Roswell, and they contain bismuth, zinc, and they're all there. I've held some of this in my own hand. It's obviously manufactured. This is not natural formations. They're layered, okay, and that is not been able. They've not been able to trace this to any manufacturing process known on the earth. So don't let anybody tell you that there's no hard evidence. Admittedly, these are little bitty pieces because where's the ship? Where's the bodies? They took them all away and they hid them away. So, with Roswell, it comes down to an article of faith. Do you want to believe the U.S. Air Force report with little or no documentation that says nothing happened? A few various debunkers with no first-hand information, or the news media, which is no real knowledge of the issue? Or do you want to believe the initial press release, more than 400, it's now 600 witnesses on the public record, thousands of leaked government documents, radar contacts, unknown bits of metal, and the fact that they went around making death threats to U.S. citizens in the wake of this Roswell incident? I don't care how important the mogul balloon was, it would have never justified telling police officers and even a 15-year-old girl that if you talk about this, they're going to be finding your bones out in the desert. I'm sorry, but there's no excuse for that kind of secrecy, not in a democratic, free country, no matter how damaging the information may be. Let me tell you how to handle that. During World War II, the Japanese were testing what they call fuego balloons or fire balloons, and they would launch these balloons from way up north, and they would drift across the Pacific and mostly come into the Pacific Northwest. And they were timed so that at a certain time they would break loose and they'd drop fire bombs. And the idea was to set big forest fires up in the Northwest to just confuse us, confound us, tie up men and material. One of them landed all the way like into Kansas or somewhere. A female reporter found out about it, went out, was on the scene, and said, boy, have I got a good story. We found this Japanese fire balloon here in Kansas. The FBI went to her and said, lady, if you run this story, the Japanese will be able to know where this balloon landed. They'll be able to calculate how effective the balloon was and what the wind currents are and everything else, and you're going to be giving aid and comfort to our enemy in a time of war. And she said, okay. And she did not publish the story until after the war. Now, that's the way you handle a secret. You don't make death threats against the civilian population. So, what do you want to believe? It happened or it didn't happen? It's up to you. All I can say is the government says it didn't happen. Now, do we trust the government? How many times have they lied to us? I lost count. I'd say this. I want to be a true blue American. And I was in the Army. But I remember taking that oath. And I swore to protect not the President, not the Congress, not the state of Texas. I swore to protect the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign or domestic. And these are domestic enemies. We know about Colonel Carso. He found whistleblowers. The whistleblowers are all over the place. You would have heard more except for the control media and except for the fact that so many of them are hesitant to speak out because many of them did sign secrecy oaths, and the people who reach rank in the military are generally men of honor and integrity. And when they pledge that they'll not talk about something, then generally they don't. The onus does not lie with them. The onus lies with the people who made them promise to be secret about what is probably the most stupendous story in the history of the human race. And they're supposed to shut up about it. Even astronauts have said that we have gained material based on crashed alien vehicles. Where it all came down, and this was the start of the whole problem we have, was the National Security Act of 1947. Now, before 1947, there had been a little talk about changing the name from the War Department to the Defense Department. Well, that's a little public relations move. Nobody wants to think they're supporting the war, but everybody wants to support defense. That's just PR. Okay, and there had been talk about separating the Air Force from the Army. It used to be the Army Air Corps, you know. And there had been talk about coordinating the intelligence services through a central intelligence agency to prevent duplication of effort with the naval intelligence, Army intelligence, Air Force intelligence. But what really got the ball rolling was Roswell. Immediately after the crash at Roswell, which is early July 1947, immediately they began to quickly put together the National Security Act of 1947 to rush into law. And in September of 1947, Harry Truman, who was president, was trying to get home to visit his mother who was dying, and they held him at National Airport for hours until they could rush out this National Security Act to get his signature on it so that bam, they could make it into law. Why the rush? And what did it do? It separated the Air Force from the Army, created the Air Force branch. We know that. It renamed the War Department to the Defense Department. It created the CIA, which has been the bane of our existence ever since. But what a lot of people miss is probably the most important facet of the National Security Act of 1947. It created the National Security Council. And if you'll think about it, everything from Vietnam to the invasion of Panama to the invasion of that island down in the Caribbean, whose name escapes me at the moment, Grenada, to everything else going on is all the National Security Council. And what did I just tell you? Barack Obama's National Security Advisor said there's a command chain that still exists in the National Security Council. The Iran-Contra scandal, Colonel North, who admitted he lied to Congress and hence lied to the American public. But he said, but I had full approval of the president. Problem is, he didn't say which president. Everybody thought he meant President Reagan. But it turns out that all the documents signed on the Iran-Contra scandal were all signed by Vice President Bush. So Bush has been giving us trouble all along. But it's all done under the National Security Council, because anything that smacks of national security obviously would come under the purview of the National Security Council. This, my friends, is when they bypassed the Constitution, the Congress, the news media, and the American public. This is when the shadow government came into being. This is exactly what happened. And, of course, one of the items they had to keep secret was UFOs. And this is still being held within the Technology Committee, or whatever they want to call it, of the National Security Council. And who's in charge of that? I've already told you. Henry Kissinger, for God's sakes. Okay? And this is where the secret has been held all this time. A secret that you, all your neighbors, everyone on earth should know about. What's the secret? We are not alone. Okay? For better, for worse. Who knows? We could argue all night over whether are they good or they bad or whatever. We'll get to some of that. They immediately created Majestic 12. Here are the original members. Okay? One of them, James Forrestal, our very first Secretary of Defense, apparently didn't go along with this program, because they said, well, he's got a mental problem. They put him in Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he either fell or was pushed out of a 17th-story window. But we now find out, and all these documents have leaked out, including this manual, Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal, Standard Operating Manual 101. All right? Press blackout. Never let the press know what's going on. This all stems back to early 50s. 1952, when flying saucers came over Washington. And at that time, everybody in the city could see them. The news media rushed out to National Airport and were going to take pictures of the radar screens that were picking them up, and they got chased out. National security. And then later, we were told it was just temperature inversion. Swamp gas. Now, one of the reasons for this secrecy was because they commissioned the Brookings Institution to do a study to try to figure out what happens if a less advanced culture comes into contact with a more technological advanced culture. So the Brookings Institution went back. All they had to work with was history. So they went back and said, well, they said Earth's civilization may topple if faced by a race of superior beings. Okay, in other words, man, stock market could crash. We might